Welcome to the second panel of the morning. First thing you should probably know if you're following your program is that I am not Professor Richard Gordon. The two of us switched panels this morning. My name is Craig Boyce. I'm a professor here at Case. I principally teach tax courses, international tax courses, although recently I've begun to co-teach with Richard in the area of anti-money laundering. This panel will address issues in informal funds and value transfer systems, and we're very pleased to have as the members of this panel, beginning at my far left, Professor Nico Passis, and I'll just, their bios are in the materials that you have. What's most pertinent to this particular panel is that he's currently finalizing the UN Legislative Guide to the UN Convention Against Corruption, which will assist national legislatures and policymakers in the implementation process. To his right is Jean-Francois Tony. And this is a small correction to the materials you have. He's no longer the Assistant General Counsel and head of the Financial Integrity Group of the IMF. He left that post and is now director of the National Judicial School in France, responsible for training of judges there. And finally, to my immediate left, Ross Delston, who is a certified anti-money laundering specialist. He does this work through globalaml.com, which is a firm that he founded in 2006, so he consults in the anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism area. But we're going to begin this panel by having Nikos make a presentation. We'll have some comments on that. Then we'll have presentation from Ross, and at some point later in this hour we'll field questions from you all. So, Nikos.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Thank you for having us here. In a nutshell, you can see in this slide the universe that I have been studying since the mid-90s, the informal value transfer systems that range from very low-tech courier type of things to very sophisticated, that's top left on your screen, to gradually more sophisticated and highly technology-enhanced methods, trade diversion and correspondent accounts. If we had a couple of weeks, I would be able to go through each one of them with you, but we're going to cover only Hawala and a little bit of trades today. And in between, we're going to take a look at the risk-based approach as implemented in the US and with respect to MSBs in particular, the money service businesses. Now, Hawala is sometimes wrongly called alternative remittance system because the alternative does not exist. There is no other alternative in many parts of the world, as you will see. It is based on trust. And in a minute you will see why it's not an underground banking system. First, it's not underground, and two, it doesn't involve any lending or borrowing, so it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not different from ordinary banking in the sense that it doesn't transfer money by physically moving the currency. You will see the mechanics in a very brief presentation. And we have to separate it from the former Hawala, because if I go into a Saudi bank and I say, where can I do some Hawala here, they will just point me to the wire transfer department, because Hawala means transfer in Arabic. So it's the informal Hawala that we're talking about today. Now, there is a myth that it is new. It has been actually for decades or even centuries there. There is a myth that it's associated with violence and corruption only. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the customers are ordinary people sending honestly earned money back to their home country. And there's a myth that there are no records. You will see in a minute why this is a myth. And it can or should be done, or it can be regulated in the same way as other Western formal types of institutions. A lot of people have tried and did not succeed. This is what Hawala looks like. If you go to Kabul, you look left and you see this. You look right and you see this. You can see that they're holding money. This is the Hawala Market. Now, I wouldn't go as far as calling this underground banking. These are the satellite antenna that they use for the settlement processes that they have. And now, why do people use Hawala? I don't know what happened. Well, we lost a few slides here. Can't we? Well, let's follow that and see how it goes. Why do people use this? It's very simple. It's cheaper. It's faster. It's more. It's convenient. It's culturally appropriate. It's available to people who cannot read or write. It's reliable, and it allows you to be discreet. So some criminals are going to use that as well. Here are, in a very brief outline, the economic advantages of Hawala. I went to Dubai repeatedly, but this is one of the visits where I compared the different ways of sending $100 from Dubai to Pakistan. And you see what I would be charged on the first column, depending on whether I use a draft from a bank or a money changer, a telegraphic transfer, that's a wire transfer, Western Union, or Hawala. And you can see that hands down, Hawala is the most competitive way. It's the lowest cost and the better exchange rate that you can get. So there are very legitimate reasons why ordinary people are going to use Hawala. Most importantly, there are no other options. There is no ATM machine here, or here, or here. Hawala is their only option. How does it work? If I am to send money to my cousin in Karachi, I'm going to go to a local operator and I'm going to give him the money. He will tell me how much my cousin is going to pick up or will be delivered to his home within 24 hours or faster if I'm in a hurry. How does it work? It's not only me sending money to my cousin, there are many others. There are people who are sending money to their relatives in Pakistan. So let's say that A is the US and B is Pakistan. In Pakistan, so we have a lot of dollars here wanting to become rupees in Pakistan. On the other hand, we have importers of goods who have rupees but need to make payments in dollars in the US for goods that they will import. What happens is that instead of money going through the ordinary from top left to bottom left to top right and the other way, money simply goes into those cash pools. The dollars are going to pay, the immigrants' dollars are going to pay the exporters, and the importers' rupees are going to pay the families' expatriates, the expatriates' families. So rupees stay rupees, dollars stay dollars. You minimize the need for currency conversion, and you don't have a lot of overhead to charge there. If these cash pools are symmetrical, you don't have any settlement problem. It all gets rerouted. It never is, however, symmetrical because people want to send to multiple places different kinds of amounts. Hence, the need for settlement through big financial centers such as Dubai, New York, London, Switzerland, and Singapore, and so on. And there you're going to have a dollar account. They're still using the dollar, although gradually they're moving more to euro settlement. And I think anyone who travels knows the reason why. And here is how they settle. This is, at the end of the day, they will take all the requests for transfers and they're going to put them in a fax that is going to be sent over to the person receiving the payment instructions. This is an example of a payment instruction. You see that there is a sequential number, a sender or a recipient, the amount, the telephone, and so on. What I want to draw your attention to is the bottom left here, where it says token number, and it has that series of numbers and letters. That means that someone with a 10 Indian rupee note that has this serial number on it will come to pick up the money. So whether that is Baba Singh or his daughter, a very common name in India, or not, doesn't matter. That's the customer identification process. They keep that 10 Indian rupee note as evidence that they delivered the money to the intended recipient. Hence the risk that you do not know who is getting the money. So we do not know unless they know and are willing to communicate that to us. This is an example of what internal spreadsheets and accounts, ledgers they keep. Each Hawala operator is going to keep for years very detailed accounts with each counterpart in each part of the world. What they have is, and this is from a case where I was serving as a witness, and that was in the UK, so they had to convert the pounds to dollars, the dollars to rupees, and you can see the exchange rate. The end balance, the last column, is the running balance that they have with the counterparts, so that they know at any given time who owes whom how much. This is some of the documentation that we had in the US African embassy bombings. You can see that even in Africa, even at the time that no one was paying attention, there was evidence of that $1,000 amount that went from Yemen and Kuwait to Africa to support the bombing in Africa. Now, how do they settle? Reciprocal payments, physical movement, ordinary bank checks, wires, and so on, or trade, invoice manipulation, smuggling, and so on. Typically, a bank is going to see this to identify a Hawala or an informal remittance system. Different instruments deposit money, and wires go to different parts of the world, the big centers where the settlement takes place. What happens there? Among legitimate things, there is also some fishy stuff that goes on in the middle of the ocean. So you're going to have goods brought by Taiwanese boats into a meeting point where the Indonesians and the Thais are going to bring in their drugs. The drugs will be picked up by Hong Kong boats. The goods are going to be taken to be smuggled into Indonesia and Thailand. They will save up to 120% import duties this way. And Hong Kong was one of the destinations for money, remember? So they're going to bring the money to pay for everyone. So those who made the goods will get paid, and those who are expecting money from overseas are going to get it very quickly. These guys are liquid at all time, and they can make very quick payments. Now, under-invoicing or over-invoicing is a very typical way of transferring value as well as breaking all kinds of laws. If I have to transfer $100,000, I can do it in this simple example. The money will go from left to right. I send an invoice for $150,000. I receive $150,000, and I sent, however, goods worth $250,000. He sells the goods, he makes the extra $100,000, and customs, even if they inspected the container and the paperwork, there is nothing there to indicate the higher value unless they inspect the chips, the software, and the specs that we had upgraded. So you can't smell the rat here. You got to have intelligence and do something in advance. Here we have invoice manipulation with between Dubai and India. $30 per item this bicycle factory charges for goods sent to Dubai. Receives the money. Dubai is another settlement center. The parts then are distributed around the world. The problem is that the value was 120. So this valuation, over invoicing, justifies the flow of money from Dubai to India. In India, however, they get also subsidies based on the value of exported goods. So the inflated invoices are going to fetch subsidies, and they're going to have fraudulent money as well as the flows coming from Dubai to be liquid and pay for anyone throughout India who expects money. So dirty money and clean are going to be mixed. And more intermediaries get involved in this, and the more intermediaries you have, the less traceable it is unless you know where to go and ask for questions. Now, we need to regulate, and we need to do something about it. The risk is that we can do things worse than better. We can drive them underground, we can criminalize unnecessarily, we can go after people who have nothing to do with crime, and we can neglect more serious problems. The findings of 5 years of research that I have is that what we have is something that leaves a lot to be desired. We are fighting terror with error. The regulation is inconsistent, misapplied, mismeasured, ineffective, costly, and counterproductive. I think there is room for improvement. Now, I have to go very fast because I don't have any time, but I will be very happy to explain in detail what happened. I want to show, however, how I have been trying to be very constructive. I have worked with FinCEN. I have provided indicators how regulators, juries, and bankers can identify suspicious activities that go through these informal networks. They are there. They have been tested in the UK as well as the US. Every time they were produced and compared with the evidence in the case ended with a plea of guilty. Or in one case, not guilty because there wasn't any problem. Now, the second the second thing you can do other than guiding the private sector and your law enforcement and controls what to do is to properly regulate. The FATF has evaluated very negatively a lot of countries around the world for not doing a good job with regulating this sector. The US has received, however, a relatively good grade, a large compliance. The only problem they had was that our threshold is a little bit too high for filing CTRs and doing all the due diligence work that's necessary. I will explain in a moment why I would not be as charitable in my grading. That we have a very reasonable federal regime. These are the things that you've got to do. Register, keep records, report suspicious transactions, know your customer, and apply AML for your registered agents. The problem is with the states, as we heard earlier, and I would like to follow up on that. At the state level, there is licensing requirement in most states. Those licenses can be provided only if you have bonds, capitalization, net worth, and so on, as well as fees for auditing and legal fees and training and so on. Let me show you why they're non-pragmatic and unenforceable. Here are the states that have the largest concentration of migrant populations. And here you see the requirements. Net worth, the first column, bond requirements, the second, in addition to the smaller fees on the right. But you can see that if I am operating out of, let's say, New York, I will have to have a minimum $500,000 as a bond. And if I have a customer in Pennsylvania, then I have to get a license from there, another $1 million. And if I have another agent in New Jersey, another $100,000 to $1 million. That is in addition to whatever training, audit, and other things that I have to do. I can tell you that I was working with FinCEN, Justice, and Homeland Security, and I had no idea about the situation until I went to the bazaar in Karachi, and they told me that you want us to comply, give us regulations that we can live with. I came back to try and find out what they were talking about, and this is the reality I came up with. What small business that tries to help the community send the $50 to $150 that a Somali in average sends to that stateless region of the world is going to be able to afford that sort of environment? Therefore, we are not increasing competition. We're giving them disincentives to register and stay on board. Now, on top of that, those who can comply, those who are going to find those resources, find their accounts shut down because the OCC issued a guideline saying that these are high risks for money laundering and terrorism finance. What are banks going to do? They're not going to make too many profits out of these accounts. Why keep them? Get rid of them. So those with the least access to financial services and those who need to be integrated and brought together in a coalition against terrorism are being alienated, pushed to the margins, asked to pay higher costs. And what options are left for those who are in this situation? Close down, not offer that service. The economic objectives that we have there are not going to be accomplished. Go underground, in which case we lose the transparency, and the other thing is, okay, we're going to increase our costs, which is not going to help with the popularity of this regulation with migrant workers. Are we focusing appropriately at this as the riskiest part of the financial system? I argue no. We don't have any convictions on terrorism finance of any MSB or financial or informal institution. We've had a lot of closures. We have some ongoing cases, but we have not had the materialization of the high risk despite the resources that have been concentrated there. What we are not looking at, I argue, is far riskier, and that is trade where we have no transparency. We'll come back to that in a moment, and I know that Ross is going to pick that up as well. But here's an example of what we're chasing. These are operational costs of attacks. You see that in some instances we're chasing hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars at most. These are distinct for operating costs, which some organizations are going to have, but not all do. These 200 euros that the two people were spending in order to plant a suitcase bomb in a train, how are you going to find that with the regulatory regime that we have there? It's not going to work. The question is, what is it that we do not know? We're trying to legislate. We're trying to apply nets that haven't worked very well against money laundering for large amounts to much smaller amounts related to terrorism, but we do not even know how to calculate. There's no consensus on how to calculate the costs. If you look at the Air India, for example, I gave you the 3,000 Canadian dollars as the cost, but some witness suggested during the major commission inquiries that the community did have $100,000 available for someone to be bribed to allow the bombs to be planted in the airplane. So sometimes the costs are actually higher than we think. So we've got to be careful about that. Secondly, in Madrid, the costs vary because people had about 15,000 euros of expenses, but then they used drugs as a barter deal in order to pay for the bomb, the explosives. Now, how do you calculate the cost of the drugs? How much it costs them to acquire them, or how much is the street value if they sold them? There you have all kinds of different estimates. But here is the problem. Unnecessary economic disruptions, high cost, and I do not know what we're getting in return for that because we have not gotten any empirical basis on which to make a reasonable debate, a reasonable assessment. We need to know what we are chasing, what is the problem, what rules and measures we've applied, and what was the outcome. Now, we have know your customer rules and all that, but anyone who travels around will tell you how easy it is to find a fake ID. And what do we think, that Mr. Belandes is going to walk into a branch with this kind of business card? These are preventive, symbolic, normative. They have a normative effect, but we have to be realistic on our expectations. He's not going to do that. Even before 9/11, the manual that was attributed to Al-Qaida, discovered in Manchester, was telling people not to keep everything together and not tell their friends and relatives what they are doing. So they will adjust, they will adapt to what we are having here. Now, while we're looking at this, where we've had crime, but not as serious as elsewhere, look at trade and what is going on there. Diamonds. There has been no connection between Al-Qaida and diamonds as argued, nothing significant anyway, as argued in some sources, and that was confirmed by the 9/11 Commission as well. But here's another problem we have in the diamond sector. When you import anything, including diamonds, you have to say who is the ultimate consignee, who puts these on their inventory. Okay? In 75% of the cases, in the last 25 years of import data that I analyzed, we have nominee trade going on here because the broker gave either his own tax ID as that of the person on whose behalf he's acting, or a fake ID, 000001, or some other ID. And that represents, as you can see, $22 billion worth of diamonds that came in, and we have no idea who brought them. At the same time, they have to say where the goods came from and what's the origin and provenance. I analyzed the rough diamonds data that we have from the Department of Commerce, and the country that exports, the largest exporter of rough diamonds to the US is the UK. Now, if in my sleep they converted the mines, the coal mines, into diamond mines, otherwise they don't have any mines to send from. And they're supposed to be both the origin and the country of export. We're not talking just about transshipment. On top of that, the variation of the value of diamonds is extreme. and you can see here the unit from a few $100s to tens of thousands, which means that the misinvoicing that I described before, it gives you a wonderful opportunity here to declare any value that you want, and you transfer the value accordingly. I looked at gold. We have imports from Trinidad and Tobago until law enforcement pays them a visit. Trinidad and Tobago doesn't have any gold mines. Then after that visit, we see a spike of imports of gold from Suriname, another country without gold mines. Then it goes to Guyana. Then it goes to the Netherlands Antilles. That is the problem. This is just justification of money going down, and we have a merry-go-round of gold. Another problem I looked at in the diamond and in the tobacco industry. Here are statistics of tobacco smoking. The tobacco smoking rates go down, and the import of tobacco into the US goes hugely up, and this is only what is attributed to Japan and Switzerland, which account for the largest increase of tobacco imports into the United States. Now, these are not the cheapest countries where I'm going to have outsourcing for cheap labor. Not that they have any plantations of tobacco. And in the case of Switzerland, where I specifically looked to see who was the exporter of tobacco, it was a cruise liner. Now, the problem is that Switzerland is a landlocked country. And on top of that, if you are in a cruise lining business, you buy duty-free cigarettes so that you can sell them to your customers. You do not buy them in order to import them into the United States, which made those tobacco products in the first place. So there are irregularities there and billions of dollars worth of transaction that make no economic sense, and no one is paying attention. So these are some policy implications I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to stop. But here they are, and I will be happy to distribute those. These are the policy implications on the regulation of MSPs. We need to be pragmatic rather than formalistic. It doesn't matter that the country has a law. What matters is whether they implement it and we catch some bad people or those who do bad deeds. That is what counts as implementation. So that is what matters, and that requires outreach, that requires, well, before I get to that, by the way, I would like to make a distinction between transparency, instant or automated visibility that we have from bank transactions, versus traceability of transactions, which is finding out who are the counterparties, what is the value, by being able to find answers if you write the right people, if you ask the right people and the right questions. If you look at the Indian bombings, for example, in Mumbai, and the parliament attacks, they were able to identify and capture the terrorists through Hawala transactions that they did because they had information from there. So there is better transparency, in fact, in those informal networks, contrary to the mythology about them, than in correspondent accounts of banks. And finally, this outreach is important. We want to regulate. We've got to ask those who are affected. We need genuine two-way communication between those regulated and those who regulate. We need to establish the facts. I mean, when we come to the point where an academic calls for the facts to get back in, we are in trouble. But I would submit that we cannot do risk analysis unless we have the facts right. And the facts have not been right for a long time. And it's about time that we peer review those who write, those who make public statements, those who argue certain things without having the empirical basis for that. So we need to take a look at the institutional capacity of countries, because sometimes we ask them to do things that they simply can't do. They pass the law, but it doesn't matter. Cost-benefit analysis to see whether we're getting into diminishing returns. Good research, solid data, analysis of that, so that we go beyond fact-free policy making. And then at that point you will see that from a lose-lose situation, we can go to a win-win situation. Security, community policing, regulation, competition, economic goals, all can be accomplished at the same time if we do it properly. If we don't, we're going to be enforcing terrorism laws like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. I think at this point, rather than taking questions, I'd like to go on and hear what Ross has to say. He's advocated the expansion of preventative measures into trade-based money laundering. And so we'll hear maybe in his presentation some bit of response to what Nikos said, and then we'll get some comment from Jean-Francois, and then open it up to questions after that.
Craig, thank you. Nikos is a difficult act to follow. I don't have slides. I follow the example of Bill Gates, who gave a presentation about the internet and in front of hundreds of people, and the whole thing crashed. So if Bill can't do it, I wouldn't even attempt it. I did work closely with Jean-Francois Tony, who taught me all he could about wine when one day we were having a party. And we used to have parties before he got there for people's birthdays, and there would be punch and ginger ale. And then the French arrived, and all of a sudden we were bringing wine. So I told Jean-Francois one day that I would bring a good California wine for the next party. And Jean-Francois responded, "There's no such thing." Of course, I have the ultimate revenge. He now lives in Bordeaux, which I am told is the Napa Valley of France. So my article on trade-based money laundering is in this blue booklet, which does not have page numbers. It's toward the latter quarter. It's entitled "The 41st FATF Recommendation: Why Preventive Measures Targeting Trade-Based Money Laundering Should Reach Beyond Banks." Of course, there will never be a 41st FATF recommendation. That number 40 is sacrosanct. It cannot be changed. Special recommendations can be changed, but just to get people's attention, I thought I would use that number. FATF did come out with a report called Trade-Based Money Laundering. They forgot the hyphen, but otherwise also forgot any serious recommendations. They talk about increased international cooperation, increased information sharing. What I think they need to talk about is a new recommendation that says not only should financial institutions target trade-based money laundering, but also industrial companies, exporters, importers, freight forwarders, FedEx, anybody involved in the process should be subject to the same program requirements, customer due diligence, reporting of SARs, record keeping, compliance officer, all of that. Typically, the FATF recommendations have focused on financial institutions with the exception of DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions. Many lawyers in the room from Europe who are still fighting the battle against the third EU directive, which repeated the second EU directive, which said that lawyers should be subject to reporting of suspicious transactions. So there are exceptions to the focus on financial institutions, also real estate agents, jewelers, gambling casinos, but not industrial companies, not those involved in the roughly 400 million containers that circulate through international trade every year. 400 million containers. I tried to find out how many of those containers were inspected coming into the U.S. I went on the DHS, is that what it's called now, DHS, website. I called friends there. I left messages in anonymous, they have these anonymous mailboxes. They're like, "This is the public relations office. If you have a phone message, please leave a message." No one's name. I never got a call back. The popular number is 5%. 5% of the containers coming to the U.S. are inspected. So 20 to 1 odds. If we were to increase that dramatically to 10%, which is sometimes called the magic of small numbers, there would be a great announcement. Twice as many containers are now being looked at, still good odds, 10 to 1. So lots of stuff coming into the country. Nikos talked about some of it. Lots of stuff circulating to all of our countries that's not being looked at. The Red Flags, another book that Nina held up, I also carry with me, except mine has a nicer cover. This is the one that the OCC puts out. This is the exam manual which in the FATF Mutual Evaluation Report of the U.S. a few years ago said was other enforceable means. Some nodding of heads. Those of you who are cognoscente of FATF know that that is a very serious analysis to be other enforceable means. But this is actually a manual that is titled Examination Manual. It's for use by examiners. No banking lawyer that I know of in the U.S. ever considered this to be enforceable. It is not now, nor has it ever been enforceable. For some reason, FATF said it was. But let's take it for what it is, which is instructions to examiners. It does have quite a bit on trade-based financing, and it has a series of red flags, and it has a series, remember, this is directed at bank examiners from the 5 banking agencies, the 5 banking regulators at the federal level in the U.S. And it does say to them that they should look at risk mitigation. So on the basis of risk to treat trade finance and trade-based money laundering as a high-risk transaction. But the problem is that, and this is not clearly stated in the article, but will be in my law review article for Case Western Reserve, the problem is that so many of the red flags deal with the documentation that the bank might look at. For example, items shipped are inconsistent with the nature of the customer's business. You might be able to find that out from looking at the documentation. Customers conducting business in high-risk jurisdictions, kind of a tough one for an American to talk about, because the INCSA report, International Narcotics Strategy, something or other, that's put out by the U.S. every year, that report, put out by the U.S. State Department, says that the U.S. is a high-risk jurisdiction. So yes, we should pay greater attention to high-risk jurisdictions, but the U.S. should be one of them. Then it has a series of things that, red flags, that banks, financial institutions would never be able to see. Obvious over or underpricing of goods and services. Well, Nikos did a good job with diamonds, but you could do it with all sorts of things, of showing us how difficult it is to price this stuff. There's wholesale prices, retail prices, special prices, discounts for large customers, locked-in prices for contracts, for fungible commodities, forward contracts. No way that a bank looking only at documentation could tell that. Obvious misrepresentation of quantity or type of goods, imported or exported. How are you going to know if it's misrepresented unless you open up that container? Shipment does not make economic sense. For example, use of 40-foot container to transport a small amount of relatively low-value goods. Some of these red flags are from the FATF report. That being one of them. Again, I'm sure there are many transactions like that. I'm sure some of those containers contain people in them, which are not at all represented on the invoices, impossible to tell. So how do you get at that issue if you want to prevent trade-based money laundering, if you want to prevent terrorist financing that is sometimes done through trade-based money laundering, and if you want to promote my secret agenda, which is my hidden agenda, which is the stuff I really worry about, which is weapons of mass destruction and the materials that make them up coming in through these containers. Because I actually don't really care that much for this purpose about trade-based money laundering and even terrorist financing. I worry about the actual acts of terrorism themselves. Having a daughter who's a biologist getting a Ph.D. in biology, I don't really worry about biological stuff or chemical stuff. She also studied chemistry. It's hard to do, it's hard to disperse, it's hard to figure out how to infect or hurt enough people. But I do worry about nuclear, and I don't see how a better way to get the stuff into any of our countries is than in one of those 400 million containers of goods. Can you find, bad stuff hidden in this vast container? I'm not sure, but my guess is, this is not fact-based regulation, but this is speculative-based regulation. My guess is that there will be other anomalies in that, in the nature of that international trade transaction. There's There'll be shell corporations, there'll be high-risk countries, there'll be things that don't make sense that will require the inspection. So my solution is simple, which is to extend the same kinds of controls we have for banks and to this small group of DNFBPs, leaving lawyers aside, because I don't want blood pressure to go up and, heart problems, palpitations from all the lawyers in the room. And as you know, in the U.S., we don't include lawyers in our preventive measures. I won't say we never will, but certainly not now. But I don't see why we wouldn't include industrial companies that export and import and everyone along the way. Will they kick and scream? Yes, the airlines kicked and screamed about security screening for passengers before 9/11. Turkey and Israel had really good screening procedures. I've been to Turkey, and they asked me why I had so many batteries in my luggage. This was my checked luggage, and I showed them my old-style Walkman, and they took away my little cosmetic scissors with the blunted ends that I was carrying on board, because in those days you could do that in the U.S., but they didn't allow it in Turkey. And in Israel, my mother-in-law, then 65, the archetypical Jewish mother with her daughter and grandchildren and husband, I was not there, was taking El Al to Israel and was questioned for 20 minutes because her bags were too light. She did not have enough luggage. She was just taking carry-on luggage, and she did not fit any profile, trust me. It was not a profile-based system. It just was an anomaly that they decided they need to find out more about. So yes, it is very tough to do this stuff. There's no question that there will be great protests from great industrial sectors, but I don't see any alternative. Nikos, do you?
No, I fully agree. Actually, the trade non-transparency in place is something that threatens not only the money laundering CTF regime, but sanctions violations, corruption, customs violations, anything that you can imagine, taxes, proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, all of that is possible. The problem is that no one's looking at the elephant in the room.
So Ross, where would you, but before we get Jean-Francois's comments, where would you begin, and what would a regulation look like that would begin to address the trade-based money laundering?
Well, in the U.S., we have a slight advantage for big companies. We have something called the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, which Jeff Breinholt can explain to all of you later, but it's basically a set of guidelines to prosecutors and judges as to how to treat white-collar criminals. And in it, it has a regime that is virtually identical to the 4 pillars in the U.S. for AML. Appoint a compliance officer. It actually goes further in some ways, because it says have a serious compliance culture, which the AML side doesn't say. And it says to have internal controls, and it says to have the board of directors involved. So the short answer is I would have the 4 pillars that apply to banks, as well as SAR reporting, apply to exporters and importers, and make them have their own compliance structure, their own compliance officers. They already have this in the U.S. for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because it applies to everyone, and they have it for OFAC, because it applies to everyone. And this would be a new regime which would be piggybacked onto that existing regime. And the selling point would be, by the way, this will help you with the federal sentencing guidelines in case you ever get caught with something really bad. And strangely enough, there are a few companies in the U.S. who are looking into this on the AML side based on the federal sentencing guidelines.
In addition to that, actually, there is a very good answer that the U.S. government has with respect to trade transparency. There is a software program that's been in existence for decades. It was developed by Customs, and it's held by a private company now. It used to be called NIPS, now it is called LeadMiner. That is a software that puts together the import and export statistics of different countries. and compares them with with other data such as peers or the importers and exporters or the shippers and the brokers records, and you can see what irregularities you have electronically. Within a second, you can find out some of the graphics that I showed you. It was where it came from using that particular software. In addition to that, that is linked with a database that contains all SARs, CTRs, CMIRs, ongoing investigations, and other databases that you wish to make available. That has been in existence, but let us say it is being underused.
Why? If it's that simple, where's the pressure coming from?
In 2 words, Homeland Security Department, 3 words. It takes so long, I can explain, but it's been a bureaucratic, and it's been the department. There's a trade transparency unit that was created, and there were funds made, that were appropriated, good funds from Congress to do something about that. It didn't happen. For years now, we're trying to get it going. There are exchanges, and Bruce is talking about it in his paper for the U.S. report to the International Association of Penal Law. But there are exchanges of data with particular countries in Latin America. There is some training that has gone on, but a very, very limited extent.
Jean-Francois, you've been at the forefront of the AML CFT regime. What are your thoughts on the thoughts of Nikos?
Well, I would say my first thought is that it's very difficult to talk after Nikos and Ross. They have basically covered all the subject matter. I'm very proud to see that Ross, with whom I've worked for many years, has now become a renowned expert. I've just lost hope to make him become an expert in wine. And that's another story.
Except for California wine.
California what? Okay, this said, I fully agree with what has been said regarding trade-based money laundering. What is important to understand is that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something which has been in the loop for many, many years. We begin now to put the finger on it, but it has been on the organized crime side one of the most profitable business that criminal organizations have made, and I think that as long as we don't take forceful measures in this area, we're going to leave aside, as Nikos said, a huge part of what money laundering and crime can cover, especially because trade-based money laundering is a double weapon in a sense. It's not only a way to launder money, but it's also a way to commit other crimes like tax fraud, like import subsidies fraud, and things like that. The best example was or the easiest example, I would say, not the best, but there were 2 of them. The first is the criminal organizations in Europe, including Italian ones, buying containers of cigarettes from the U.S. in cash. So first they were laundering their own cash that generated from drug trafficking and etc. And these cigarettes were sold tax-free, of course, and they were generating money out of it. So not only they were laundering their money, but also making profit out of the business. And I've seen that in many occasions. I remember in Turkmenistan, where sometime just after the end of the Cold War, some criminal organizations were buying in cash trains of kerosene, just in cash. So they were laundering their money there, exporting the kerosene in Colombia, where it was used as part of the process of transforming cocaine in cocaine. Last example was quoted by the by ICE, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement, of the Colombian organization making some. It was so complex that I could not summarize it today. But basically, gold coming in and out between Colombia and the United States, serving part to repatriate the assets of drug trafficking, being reprocessed into tools. So they were gold tools re-imported into the U.S. to get export subsidies, and then selling the gold back in the U.S. again. It was. This is also a typical example of it. This is one issue which is clearly linked to organized crime rather than terrorism financing. I'm not aware of any case of trade-based terrorism financing. We have to be clear about it. Well, we'll come back on this. Maybe there are some, but it's not. We could not extrapolate for them to address it as a clear terrorism financing issue, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Hawala is certainly more of an issue, and there, as Nikos rightly and brilliantly said, there is not much to say or to do about it. Two things that I would like to add to complement to what Nikos said. The first is that in addition to the complexity of the issue, when you look at the way countries address Hawala and informal fund transfer systems, you realize that in terms of compliance with FATF Special Recommendation 6 on this issue, the poorer the country, the less compliant it is with this specific recommendation. Whereas the real issue is in the poorer countries rather than in the richer country. The other thing is that the more you regulate in this area, of course, the lesser the risk, but also the lesser the attractiveness for terrorists or even for criminals, which means that, as you've rightly mentioned, I mean, when you comply with the FATF recommendation in this area, and so you subject to license, you subject to fit and proper tests, you subject to know your customer procedures, to compliance monitoring, etc., etc. You cannot talk, of course, of informal business anymore. You have transformed it into a formal system, but you have not solved the problem. The informal business goes elsewhere for a number of reasons, including a number of legitimate ones. So, are there some reasons to be optimistic? I would say yes. I think we have to continue to be optimistic. Fighting against money laundering and terrorism financing is not a job when you can just do something and up the problem is resolved. This will never happen. What you do, and I've been doing that all my life as in fighting crime and organized crime. You just close the door, knowing that they will come at a window or open another one. So you jump and close the other one. But as long as you do that, you make the life of the bad guy difficult. And what I consider what should be the performance indicator in this respect is just trying to find indication that you are making the life of the bad guys difficult. And I think that in the area of terrorism financing, even though it is clear that we leave big doors open, we oblige the criminal and the terrorist organization to move their way and go elsewhere to do their dirty business. And I must say that in a number of cases, it has made their life difficult. If you consider that the strategic ultimate objective of counterterrorism financing measure is to prevent terrorist acts, there you can say that we have failed. But if, although there are, I know at least one case which was successful in this respect, if you consider that the ultimate objective of these measures is to disrupt the functioning or make the functioning of terrorist organizations difficult, then it is serving its purpose to a certain extent, of course, but it is serving its purpose. And the other reason to be optimistic, in my view, is that we have to keep in mind that terrorist organizations are not that sophisticated. Usually they will go to the most, in terms of financial operations, they will go to the most simplistic way to bring money from one place to another, except maybe in the case of Al-Qaida, where bin Laden was a real finance person, knowing all the subtleties of offshore and Islamic banking possibilities. Usually, they really want to use the most simplistic and easiest way to bring money from one place to another. So basically, terrorist cells would either transport it then by themselves or would use Hawala system whenever they can, rather than going through sophisticated offshore companies. This is a generality, of course. There are cases of more sophisticated terrorism financing operation, but what we do see on a day-to-day basis would more correspond to this pattern. So this is what I wanted to add to this point, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.
But before we open it up to questions, I have one other sort of broader question I'd like to get your brief response. This is the World Conference on Combating Terrorist Financing, and I think we could all agree that combating terror is a very high priority. There are people who are maybe somewhat skeptical, maybe in this room are somewhat skeptical about combating terrorist financing, particularly given the fact that if for example, looking at Nikos' slide that illustrated the costs of a number of terrorist activities over the last decade or so, amounted to a few millions of dollars. We have an international banking system that understood the value of prudential regulation with Basel, was less enthusiastic about anti-money laundering measures, but has bought in. Have we gone far afield, do you think, here in sort of leveraging the international financial system to deal with this problem? Ought we to be focusing on combating terror in other ways as opposed to financing?
Well, the combating terrorism finance is one. The tools that we have are in the toolkit that we have against terrorism in general. I think that they are essential and necessary because they reduce the harm that can be brought about by terrorist attacks. It provides opportunities for intelligence gathering and investigative leads for finding out co-conspirators after the fact. So we need them, but we need to also be realistic about what we can accomplish. We need also the risk-based approach so that we can mitigate a little bit the costs of regulation so that we can focus on the areas that are most vulnerable. With respect to trade, there have been some examples of trade and terrorist finance as well. You look at FARC and AUC, for example, on gold. You look at the Northern Alliance groups and emeralds. You look at, depending on your definition, militant groups in Africa using diamonds. You look at PKK, LTTE, IRA, and others using trade and trade kind of methods and laundering the funds then in the same way. Tobacco and Hezbollah. We've had a lot of cases that show that. But the point is also one of plausibility. If I am a sympathizer of cause X, and I'm in the import-export business, and I know how to cheat anybody without anybody doing anything, of course I'm going to use that as a way of doing it. It's a vulnerability that we're talking about. We do not know because we're not looking.
If I can just pick up on something that Jean-Francois said, and I do owe him a lot of credit because almost everything I know about AML-CFT I learned from Jean-Francois. So any deficiencies, of course, are laid at his feet. But he did say that it's a life's work and it's a continuing battle. And I guess I would say in response to Craig's point specifically about CFT measures with banks and other formal financial sector players is that it's necessary but not sufficient. We have to do these things, but we can't expect that they are sufficient unto themselves to eliminate the problem. We also have to do lots of other things that Nikos has so brilliantly and colorfully showed us.
All right, let's take questions. We have a microphone here, so does anybody have any questions or comments about what you've heard?
I don't see how they could really, but
It was so clear. Okay, right down here.
Banks are easy. I mean, this comes from somebody who knows nothing about banking, but I mean, it's one sector of the economy. There are only so many variations on what banks do. Generating, we heard actually from the first panel that generating sort of red flags isn't so easy, even in this one sector of the economy that banks tend to do similar things from bank to bank. Well, when you get to trade-based money laundering or terrorist financing, you're suddenly talking about a much, much more complicated world where there are all sorts of different kinds of trades. There would be different kinds of markers and indicia of what's a funny transaction. And this is this is mostly a question, I suppose, to Ross, but for all of you.
I'll let Nikos answer.
And it's an unfair question because how could you possibly have an answer, which also lets you off the hook, but do we have any conception of what it would cost to regulate seriously in the area of suspicious trade-based activities? What sort of burden are we imposing? Whether it's burdens on the state or more likely burdens on those folks who are engaging in trade to be able to do this well and effectively.
Well, let me take a first crack, and then Jean-Francois and Nikos, I hope, will chime in at any point. When you talk about a cost-benefit analysis in the U.S. with AML-CFT, and I'm losing my voice just thinking about it, cost-benefit analysis, but the last time I heard it was a Treasury Department representative explaining why there was no final rule for hedge funds to be subject to AML. They were looking at cost-benefit analysis. I don't think it works here. That yes, the costs are very high, yes, the benefits are unknown, but I think to try to quantify criminal activities and the effect they might have, and terrorist activities and the effect that they might have versus the costs of preventing those effects is virtually impossible. So, yes, it's a valid point, but the only context I've heard it raised in, at least in the debate in the U.S. thus far, is to try to stop something from going forward that is really unjustifiable. In the U.S., almost every financial institution is covered by AML rules except for hedge funds and investment advisors.
The question of the costs on the banks. I think that the cost can come down if we are more realistic on what we are asking them to do, and both for the financial sector and the the commercial sector, if government authorities can issue red flags, indicators on the basis of empirical analysis of what cases we have seen and what they tell us about what is irregular and what is suspicious, then you have the software already in place to do that. In addition to that, with respect to the trade transparency that can be accomplished, there is no need for new regulation other than saying that the records that you already keep, every importer and exporter have the records of their counterparties. Every broker has the same. Every shipper has the same. They don't have to we don't have to require new paperwork. All we're trying to do is take all the existing information and putting it together, and then putting that together with what is available in the financial sector. So effectively, we're turning on the lights where there is darkness, and it is not going to be any cost involved there. But again, with respect to trade diversion and many other trade techniques where you can do all kinds of hanky-panky, honestly, any offense that you want, you can commit through trade. There are red flags if you do case studies to see what is it that it becomes visible to the banker or the importer or the shipper or the broker. If I am issuing a letter of credit for someone who's importing tons and tons of gold from a country that is on some kind of sanctions list, should I not raise a red flag? So it's simple.
You have it right down here.
Bruce Segaris from Washington. Yeah, I think one of the most important elements of AML in terrorist financing regulation is the need to make them cost effective. And the problem is that when FATF and international organizations make their soft law standards, they don't do that. I mean, you basically have a handful of law enforcement and Ministry of Finance officials making rules without any consideration of the cost. And what you have now is the fact that both medium and small countries and medium and small banks and financial institutions, and sometimes even large financial institutions, are not able to effectively implement them. And I think that's a huge problem.
We have a question back here.
May I answer just a quick point? Well, one thing about money laundering is also to keep in mind, yes, there are some problems with respect to the cost of implementing those measures in not very rich countries. However, given the volume of international instruments they are called upon to implement, there are synergies. There is a large following, for example, for the UN Convention Against Corruption by developing countries. If you look at the money laundering FIU, seizure and freezing kind of provisions in that convention, is carbon copy from the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So you implement a lot of things at the same time if you do it with synergies. Another point to bear in mind is that the biggest money laundering problem is where the dirty funds are generated, where the illegal markets operate. Now, if I'm a money launderer or an organized criminal, I do not want to have my winnings, my profits in pesos, and I will have to get them from where the big markets are, and that is Europe, North America, and Japan, and Australia. So that is where the laundering circle starts, and that is where we have to pay attention to. So the money laundering risk in some countries is much lower than we think it is. We have a lot under our control, and we can we can do. They may end up in some kind of offshore jurisdiction and so on, but they've got to get here from there, from here.
And this was, just to add to that, this was actually what the first FDIC report back in 1990 came to the conclusion that even though you have, especially in offshore centers, a lot of dirty business going on, at some point it comes back, or it comes from a country where you can do some better regulation.
Just one last point. I mean, Bruce is correct that it's been difficult for financial institutions, even the largest, to implement AML, particularly the AML side, as opposed to the CFT side. But if you look closely, as Bruce has, at the enforcement cases in the U.S., they tend to be very basic failures, not sophisticated, subtle, arcane sorts of things. Didn't file SARs, found them in a drawer, dating back a year. Didn't have a compliance officer properly trained. The latest Seagate case, a large MSB, the government sent in undercover operatives who said to the agents of this company, we are marijuana sellers. We have a lot of money we'd like to send. Can you help us or tell us how can we send it without all that paperwork? And throughout this company, they got this solicitous response. I was shocked by the fact that the agents knew how to do it, and they were helped in structuring the transactions to fall below the $10,000 reporting requirement. Not subtle stuff. So yes, burdensome, but no, I don't think it's unfair to ask an MSB to train and supervise its agents.
My name is David Finn. I work for a local financial institution. I try to shepherd this issue through our institution, and I've become an avid believer in faith-based examination. And it seems to me that before you can conduct any cost-benefit analysis, you have to determine what it is you're trying to accomplish. And while I respect all of the comments this morning, we haven't yet defined what the objective is that we're trying to accomplish, particularly with regards to the financial institutions. That is the largest frustration that that our institution probably has. What is it that the financial institution is being held accountable for? We only have one piece of this jigsaw puzzle, and it might be a critical piece, but we don't know that. And in the trade-based finance discussion, that is an extremely difficult piece. And my final comment is that the exam process has become a checklist. You know, we've got to make sure you've got this, you've got that, you've done this, you filed these SARs, and you go right down through that checklist. And for those of us who understand the educational system in this country, it's sort of like no bank left behind. But what are we being held accountable for?
I just want to say a word. I fully agree with you. From the strategic point of view, you have to have your objective very clear to see if the means are appropriate to address them. That's obvious. And the problem in AML CFT policies is that at some point the public policies are overlapping. And at some point, you are not clear enough anymore about what the real objective is. And this can be true in particular with regard to trade-based money laundering. Is the objective fighting organized crime? Is it fighting fraud or fighting tax fraud in particular? I'm not sure. When I see law enforcement authorities from time to time reporting on trade-based money laundering cases, you see there pure excise fraud issues, but nothing to do with money laundering. And even I always say that the reference to money laundering itself is misleading. Because money laundering, we are not fighting against money laundering. We are fighting against organized crime. The money laundering is a process that criminal organizations use to hide their profits and cut the link between the organization, the profit, and the crime. And therefore, if you consider that preventing the laundering process is the ultimate objective, you are out of track. This is not the ultimate objective. So I think at some point authorities should sit down and try to clarify what their objectives are. I mean, there have been in this area in particular, there have been a lot of confusion between what was criminal policies and what was policies relating to bank regulation, for example. And I agree with this.
We have time for just
Can I just supplement very quickly? I agree with Jean-François, and we have discussed it before. There are two very quick points. One is that without having trade-based money laundering control, everything that you have in financial controls is undermined, no matter how effective and costly they are, because all I need to do is do some import-export transactions and a cash transaction here and there, and you lost my trail. So all this is for naught if we do not have that supplement. Secondly, I absolutely agree. We got to find out exactly who is the target and what kind of offenses can we do. In the end, FIUs, for the most part, will have to do some analysis and say, with all this stuff, this is what we produced. These are the kinds of leads that we got. These are the kinds of cases that we made. And this is what we recovered. And this is what we prevented. I think with this kind of openness and consensus building, consensual knowledge, I think we're going to get a lot further.
we have time for one more quick question. Stuart?
I almost gave up. I'm Stuart from the World Bank. Just picking up on what Jean-François was saying, maybe to be provocative, following, I think it's Bruce who mentioned about the burden on the state and issues of low capacity. I deal a lot with developing countries, and when you hear about coming up with another standard to do with trade-based money laundering, I think of two things. One, whether or not we are missing the point about some of the high taxes in a number of developing country jurisdictions in terms of why small businesses or exporters or importers want to avoid paying tax to the governments because it's too high. So precisely it has to do with tax fraud, and some of the cases I've looked at have to do with that. But secondly, wouldn't there be an unintended consequence of imposing these controls on, say, importers in the US? And if I'm exporting from a small jurisdiction, exporting bananas or oranges, looking at what has happened with banks with regard to correspondent banking relationship, wouldn't there be an unintended consequence of imposing a lot of costs on a small exporter in terms of entering a huge market like the US? And therefore, we miss the point when, again, you want to address money laundering as opposed to addressing some of the underlying fiscal and or economic issues.
Well, I mean, certainly true that that some of, to take the first point first, that some of this relates to avoiding import and export duties. But last time I looked, that was a crime, and it generates proceeds. It sounds like a predicate crime to me. It's a kind of tax that a lot of governments need to collect because they have trouble collecting other types of taxes. And as to your second point, small versus big countries, I mean, I think that that this type of requirement should fall more heavily on the big countries. The U.S. certainly is a massive importer and therefore should be examining the cargo that comes in to a greater degree than smaller countries. But I think there's a place here for all. I think it would be a mistake to exempt or to have a kind of sliding scale for smaller countries, because all that does is shift the focus, as Jean-François and Nikos have pointed out repeatedly. I mean, it's scary to me that you have organized criminals who are selling drugs, who are then getting into tobacco, which I always thought was a very dangerous thing to be involved with, the cancer that it produces.
And a similar discussion is also with respect to corruption in the Caribbean, where you have a lot of small islands with all kinds of resource issues. What is being discussed there, however, is the possibility of pooling resources with external assistance to have one agency that will help with the planning, with the analysis, and with the enforcement. So you can do some pooling of resources, and there are all kinds of bilateral and multilateral institutions with good budgets, and they can assist with that. I think it's a good cause.
Nikos, you're right, except that Stuart also referred to corruption. There are lots of places I can think of, the former Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, where customs jobs are auctioned off. They're so valuable that to get a job like this was anecdotal evidence from one of the ICE immigration customs enforcement guys that I used to deal with when I was at the IMF. And it was direct first-hand information that he had. I can't get into more detail. And it was quite shocking. I don't know where you get the money in these places to pay the bribe to get the job, but the idea is once you got the job, you were set for life.
You pay later.
Installments.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Let's give all of our panelists a hand. I think next on the agenda is lunch. I'm not sure where that is being served. Outside. Thank you.